In May and June, we gave it a little bit of a break, but we're glad to be picking it up again. For some of you who have joined some of the prior ones, this is going to be a little bit different today in that it's not as much of a presentation as it is a conversation with two people who are involved together with VNRC and a lot of other folks in a pretty important initiative called Half Earth Vermont. And it's closely related to a national, actually an international initiative called 30 by 30, with the goal of conserving 30% of the nation's air or water and land resources by 2030, and continuing that to get to the point where we can conserve half of our land and water in order to protect life on Earth and biodiversity and ultimately humanity. This concept has its foundation in the work of E.O. Wilson, and our two guests today are going to talk about kind of the concept of Half Earth Vermont, where it came from, why it's important, and then we're going to end with a little bit of an overview of the national effort, the 30 by 30 campaign. We're really lucky to have two guests today. Walt Poleman is a senior lecturer and director of ecological planning at University of Vermont. He specializes in natural history, place-based landscape analysis, and education for sustainability. He teaches courses in natural history and human ecology, landscape inventory and assessment, and conservation science. He's the co-director of the Field Naturalist Ecological Planning Graduate Program and serves as faculty advisor to the Sustainability Learning Community. Walt is also the founding director of the Place-Based Landscape Analysis and Community Engagement Program at UVM, and I've had the good fortune to work with him in the past on some of the place-based work that he's done in Vermont, and really glad that he can join us. And Walt, you live in Richmond, right?
I used to live in Richmond. I actually live in Burlington now.
Okay. And joining Walt is Curt Lindberg, who is the director. Curt's background is in the medical field. He's the director of the Billings Clinic Partnership for Complex Systems and Healthcare Innovation, and a health scientist at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. He has served as president and chief learning and science officer of Plexus Institute, which is an organization devoted to fostering the health of individuals, families, and communities. And our natural environment by helping people use concepts emerging from the new science of complexity. Curt is my neighbor here in Waitsfield, and he was the driving force behind forming the Alliance for Half Earth Vermont. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm not sure who's going to go first, Curt or Walt, but maybe to talk about the Half Earth concepts, where it comes from. I think, Curt, you're going first. And why it was important to you to kind of bring that effort to Vermont.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm going to start with a little story that Walt and I were part of. This was back in October of 2018, and we were at the Museum of Natural History in New York City for Half Earth Day. We were part of a contingent of kind of 10 Vermonters. And during one of the breaks during that day, I introduced one of our Vermont contingent members, George Schenk, who many of you know is the founder and owner of American Flatbread. George operates also a small farm next to the Flatbread restaurant in Waitsfield. So I introduced George to E.O. Wilson, and George says, you know, this problem, this challenge of half Earth and biodiversity loss seems so overwhelming and so big. And I just have this little farm, you know, and I'm trying to provide good habitat for Vermont species. I'm trying to have, you know, healthy soil. But, you know, I'm not sure that really matters. And E.O. Wilson, who is now 90, kind of looked up from his seat and said, George, that counts too. That counts too. And I'm sure George will never forget that interaction with E.O. Wilson. I think the path that got us to that Half Earth Day almost a couple years ago started when I kind of moved to Vermont a few years ago, and I wanted to get connected with some of the conservation work in the state. And I was incredibly impressed, by what's going on in Vermont and the wonderful organizations like VNRC and Vermont Land Trust and so forth, and all the great work they were doing. Yet I knew that it's still insufficient. And so I started thinking about, well, could I make a small contribution to kind of accelerating that effort? And kind of knowing E.O. Wilson, I was familiar with this Half Earth project. So that kind of led the 10 of us. And Walt was a real leader in helping to identify other people who might form, a little kind of exploratory group. So off we trekked to New York City a couple years ago. And we came back from that experience kind of energized and really committed to try to introduce E.O. Wilson's work in Vermont. And so that got us going about 1.5 years ago. And Walt, I'm kind of thinking maybe you could share a little bit about the E.O. Wilson and the kind of science behind Half Earth.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, Curt. And thanks for inviting us, Brian, today to share about Half Earth. This has been a really exciting part of sort of my work recently. And I just want to welcome everybody here today that's joining us on this, this call. Great list of people. Thanks for your interest in protecting biodiversity in Vermont. I do have some slides here that I'm going to share that will, I think, amplify what Curt was talking about, the science behind Half Earth. And team, if for some reason I fade out due to my internet connection, just pick up and show those slides that Curt was talking about. But I will, what I need to do is just briefly move down to those slides here and share my screen here.
You're shared, just click present again.
Excellent.
On the top right of the Google slide.
Thank you so much. I get
No
it.
problem.
There it is. Excellent. Okay, yeah. So if you're like me, you've been an avid reader of E.O. Wilson's work in the past. Some incredible books out there about his life as a naturalist. An incredible book actually called Consilience. If you haven't seen that one, it's really about bringing the social sciences and natural sciences together. This book came out a couple years ago, Half Earth, and it was really E.O. Wilson's vision for facing the sixth extinction or the biodiversity crisis that's in front of us now. And this is really explains kind of the details about it. But here's a picture of E.O. Wilson doing his work in communities, in this case in Africa, really basically, he says here, the only solution to the sixth extinction is to increase the area of inviolable natural resources, reserves to half of the surface of the earth or greater. And this is really, an intense response to a crisis, but one that I think E.O. Wilson describes as sort of a moon landing for humanity. If we can pull this off into the future, it will be one of our greatest legacies. And so he has really provided the inspiration for this. And this idea of half is something that I'd love to have a discussion about today, because a half is a lot of the earth. And he is basically saying if we can protect half of the area for the more than human world, we'll be able to conserve 85% of the remaining species. So this is all rooted in a scientific approach to conservation that looks at really where biodiversity inhabits, and the idea that if we can get to 50%, which is still an incredible goal, is that the possibility is that we could save up to 85% of the remaining species. So this became Half Earth, and Curt was talking about Half Earth Day, which is 6 months after Earth Day. So I think it's coming up on October 22nd again. And it's really to draw attention educationally to this vision and trying to galvanize people from around the world to look at how can we sort of approach this in a way that many, many, many people can get behind. And it's really about protected natural areas. And how this applies to Vermont is something that's really interesting to look at. And I hope we can get into that today, because in some ways, yes, it is literally about half protected areas, but as Curt was describing in George's interaction with E.O. Wilson, it's as much about what we can do on our own landscapes. And in some ways, maybe not half of the land physically, but half of our energies could go towards how we manage landscapes that we steward.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
And Walt, I'm thinking, how did, you know how Wilson arrived at the 85%? And I'm kind of remembering that it was, I guess, his estimate and that of others that if we can preserve that percent of the existing species, that will increase the likelihood that ecosystems can actually function and not collapse. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely part of it, because, when we think about biological diversity, we certainly are thinking about, representatives of different species, certainly, but we're also thinking about the genetic complexity and populations of different species and the landscapes that they inhabit. But I think particularly it's the interactions, the diversity of interactions that occur between species in an ecosystem that really is kind of the glue that holds things together. And we know that if we lose too many, that actually ecosystems can collapse. And so I think you're exactly right, that this is a functional number as well as an ambitious number.
Yeah.
So Curt, maybe we could, you could talk about coming back from New York and your efforts to pull together a group of folks to form the Alliance for Half-Earth Vermont. It was a little over a year ago that a lot of the different conservation organizations and folks gathered at the North Branch Nature Center in Montpelier and talked about the Half-Earth movement and how to apply it to Vermont.
Yeah, that was like a winter day, and we had 100 people that jammed into the North Branch conference room. And that effort, one, was to introduce Half-Earth to folks who weren't familiar with it. But more importantly, it was to, I guess, gain the guidance from the leaders of conservation organizations around the state as to how best to do that, and where should we start, and what should we concentrate on. And the guidance we got was to pay lots of attention to education, to teachers and students, because I think they felt that was maybe a missing link in efforts in Vermont. So off we went on that path. We involved a group of teachers from across the kind of Winooski watershed, and with help from North Branch Nature Center and the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, we had a bio blitz with 10 different schools, I guess about a year ago now. And then that spawned, some additional steps. Actually, this week, North Branch Nature Center is hosting a biodiversity institute for teachers. A week-long program. The schools also got involved in sponsoring, along with North Branch and again the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. We had a spring backyard bio blitz when we were all home this spring, and we had hundreds of people.
It might be helpful to explain what a bio blitz is. That might not be a term that's familiar to everybody.
Okay, all right. So a bio blitz, actually, I think probably Wilson was one of the thinkers behind it, but it's an effort within a constrained period of time, say a day, say a weekend, say a month, to identify as many species as possible within a specific geographic area. And one of the main tools for doing that is iNaturalist. So you can help you identify species and then kind of record them. So this spring, if my memory's right, there were hundreds of people involved from throughout the state, teachers and many students, and there were, I think, over 10,000 observations made across the state and kind of 1,300 species identified. So the schools, I'm sure, will kind of continue and make that a kind of a regular part of their offering, and we're hoping to involve more schools, and importantly, to have that trigger kind of at the school level, discussions about how can we preserve or convert land on school property to protect and provide homes for Vermont species. And we're calling that half school. So what have I missed there?
I'd be curious some of the other activities. One thing that you mentioned that's important to me, when I first got involved in this, VNRC has been working on forest fragmentation issues for several years now. The state of kind of folks know the story of deforestation after European colonization. And that really resulted in both an economic and an ecological breakdown in the state. And then over the 100 years, roughly between the 1860s and 1960s, the forest recovered. But we're now at a point where we're losing our forest again. And we work on kind of state policy, on land use planning, and on land conservation. As a lot of folks know, Vermont has some fairly strong conservation programs. There is an effort afoot now to try to do more forest conservation across the state. But you mentioned the half school and that the story about George being able to do something on his property. I'm curious about that, kind of what an individual can do that's not part of a larger land conservation effort, but just managing your own land.
Right. Well, I think it was one of the teachers in our group that Walt introduced to us, Sandra Ferry from Camel's Hump Middle School in Richmond. At one of our planning meetings, she said, half yard, half school, half forest, half valley, so on up to half earth. So we've kind of adopted that as a mantra, which, as you suggest, Brian, calls each of us to think about what can we do at any of those different scales to help protect biodiversity in Vermont. So that can start at your yard level or your school level, and there are some great resources. There's some of you have heard of Doug Talamay. He has a brand new best-selling book out called Nature's Best Hope. And he contends that to get to to Edward Wilson's ambition, we can't rely just on parks, and protected forests and public lands, that citizens have to get involved and do whatever they can in their backyards, in the forests they own, in the farms they run, in the towns they live in, to provide the kind of habitat that species in Vermont depend on.
Well, it was a little bit of a leading question because, as you know, VNRC, in partnership with the National Wildlife Federation, have a backyard habitat program, which is a self-certification to provide certain features on your property that benefit diverse wildlife populations. I know, Walt, if you can show that slide. And then there's other programs like that. I think Audubon has a backyard habitat for the birds program, and there's other resources around Vermont that can help folks kind of understand what some of the simple steps you can take to provide for habitat on your property.
Well, you know, and Walt, maybe you could chat about Vermont conservation design, because that's another great resource that Vermonters have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was interesting when we started this. You know, we came back from New York, you know, really kind of fired up about hearing from Dr. Wilson about what we could do, and we came back, and Curt was tremendous at linking to different conservation partners. And what became clear early on was that there is just tremendous science that's been done in Vermont. And this is an example of it, Vermont conservation design. You know, this is really, you know, the work that brings together Fish and Wildlife Department, Forest Parks and Recreation, Vermont Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, and groups like VNRC and others really kind of working with this. And so that the science is there. And it sort of reminds me on some level of, you know, what we're in with our COVID situation, where, you know, the science, although not perfect, it can really provide a template on how we can move ahead. And really bringing that to the people in thoughtful ways and engaging people is really the piece that was needed. And I've just been incredibly impressed by the Vermont conservation design. And it really talks about this idea of forest fragmentation, you know, riparian areas, their importance, and this idea that a whole suite of landscape features together, including interior wildlife habitat, together with clean water and clean air, really sets the stage for allowing the more than human world to thrive amongst the population of Vermont. And if you haven't seen this website or document, you know, this is really this map really kind of brings it all together. You know, it shows sort of half of Vermont here in some ways, but it's really, where are the high priority natural communities and habitat features? Where are the large areas, you know, the unfragmented blocks, you know, where are the edges? And particularly important is how these things all fit together. How are they connected? And so there's a template here, a blueprint for the areas that we need to bring together. And I think that really set the stage for us in the Half Earth Project. How could we focus our energies? And one of them really was to focus on this idea of education, bringing science into the communities, working with lead teachers, working in libraries, doing programs like this. I'll share in a minute the work I do with Vermont Law School, working with lawyers in training around this work. And then super importantly, is getting people engaged through citizen science and bringing that science back to these larger organizations and the policy makers in ways that connect to people's hearts. It's not really just, you know, we need to tell the story, certainly, of the intensity of the biodiversity crisis we're in. And it's not a hopeful story, but combining that with engaging people with the natural history of their communities, I think is a kind of a recipe we're hoping is going to yield promise. And it already has been here in Vermont.
Well, that makes me reflect on one of the comments that E.O. Wilson makes in his book. You know, when he says, yeah, this is a moonshot. This seems insane to aim this high. But then he points out that human development and human beings are at their most fulfilled when they're contributing to something important that is beyond themselves. So here you have a chance in your backyard, you know, to answer his call to do something, you know, that'll impact, you know, the globe. And I find that very motivating, and I think others do too.
So I appreciate your pointing out Vermont conservation design, Walt, because that is there's excellent science behind it, and you've got to give some credit to the Agency of Natural Resources for providing the technical support and leadership for that. That's been years in the making, and it really is an incredible resource. So you mentioned the pandemic. I didn't want to lose sight of this, kind of going back out to a high elevation. In talking about today ahead of time, I forget which one of you it was who mentioned that the biodiversity crisis, the great extinction that's going on now, and the last loss of habitat around the globe, has very real human health consequences, including the pandemic that we're in. I think one of you mentioned that coronavirus is an invasive species in a way, and as we get into develop more areas that have historically not been developed, that it introduces new new threats to humanity. I wonder if you could touch on that.
Well, I think the research is growing that viruses, for instance, they exist. They are in nature, and within kind of intact ecosystems, their population, if you will, is managed kind of naturally. And when we begin to destroy that habitat, when humans begin kind of moving into that habitat, as climate change happens, as species die off and some of the natural predators, are become extinct, that can release, a virus like the coronavirus into a very susceptible population. So, I live in the Mad River Valley and we're overrun with knotweed. No natural controls. I think that's exactly what's happening with the coronavirus. And if we're to, live healthier lives in partnership with nature, we need to understand what we're doing to nature that's allowing outbreaks like this.
Great. Hey, we have a question from one of the participants, and this maybe goes back to you, Walt. Jessica's asking how the high priority areas were identified in part of the conservation by design.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I froze there for a minute, but I'm back.
You're good.
I think it's largely high priority areas are looked at. A lot of its association with the whole natural community mapping process. And if you're not familiar with natural communities, they're really, it's a classification system that looks at how ecology is expressed on the landscape. So high priority areas are areas that may have unique or uncommon natural communities there, either terrestrial or aquatic. And sometimes it actually has to do with the underlying geology or the sort of different enduring features. Those areas, even though if they're not hosting the biological diversity right now, they have the potential to be in the future. Also areas that, are largely intact right now and, have the greatest potential to host biodiversity in the present time, sort of large unfragmented areas are also high priority areas. So the kind of the combination of specialness and size and current condition.
Great.
One of the cool features of Vermont conservation design, and it's kind of online partner called BioFinder, is that you can take that map that Walt showed and you can zero down to your property, or your forest, and so you can see the findings from Vermont conservation design that relate to that specific piece of property and how those priorities relate to those kind of all around you. So it's a wonderful way of thinking about your place in Vermont in a larger context. And then it actually provides some specific kind of conservation activities that relate, to each of those properties.
Mm.
If I could just jump in and share my screen for a moment, hopefully
Yep.
You can still hear me. I wanted to show essentially just a map here. One of the strategies that, can you see the map of the Winooski River watershed right now?
Yep. Yep,
Okay, good. One of the strategies we've been using with Half Earth Vermont is to really focus on a certain place. And we chose, for a number of reasons, to focus on the Winooski River watershed as a starting point for really applying these half-earth concepts, both in terms of the conservation science, the ecosystem restoration, but also the community education and community and citizen science activities that could happen. And so our goal is really to kind of focus and work with communities in the watershed to see if we can move the dial on things like habitat restoration and education about biodiversity. And the reason we focused on this is because, as we know, our conservation, environmental and social issues are many. And for instance, water quality in Vermont, both in certainly the tributaries, but as they flow into Lake Champlain, is a major issue. That is really one that's based on land use,
It's like Walt froze again. So maybe Curt, you could talk about, there you go, Walt, you froze just after you said land use.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Rewind.
I'll rewind and say, I'll just be succinct and say we wanted to focus at the watershed level because not only are we thinking about biodiversity in this larger landscape level and the connectivity and the special features there, but if we combine this with thinking about local food production and water quality and economic viability, it sort of keeps us honest in a lot of ways around thinking about how we can achieve this as we're achieving other values.
So we have another question which raises to me an important point is we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about land management, whether it's managing your forest or managing your backyard. We've talked about land conservation, and we talk about land use. And in Vermont, land use decisions are made by landowners under the rules that are created primarily by municipalities. And there was a question from Sabina. How are we educating the professional associations of developers, engineers to the concepts of conservation design and using things like plan unit developments, which is a zoning tool, to help minimize fragmentation? And she goes on to mention that in Jericho, they're always working towards improving our development regulations and to include protections for open space. But it'd be great if the design started out with conservation in mind from the beginning. So I will say, I'll ask Stephanie to put up a link to Community Strategies for Forest and Wildlife Habitat Conservation, which is a VNRC publication. We are going to be updating that in the near future to reflect some recent legislative changes that relate to forest conservation in the state. And that's designed for local planners, developers, folks who are interested in both regulatory and non-regulatory tools that are available to communities to promote land conservation. Either through the land use planning process, the regulatory process, or through voluntary conservation efforts. And VNRC has in the past taken those strategies and done trainings for Vermont realtors and engineers, because in many communities, those are the folks who are really influencing land development, working with landowners who are looking to subdivide their property. So Steph did get a note of that up. And then David over in Bristol said, with action needed soon, how can we tap existing programs to address better the issues that face us? Vermont's use value program could be adjusted to protect many more wild forests in Vermont. What David's referring to as the use value program is the current use program. That's the program that both farmers and forest landowners can enroll in and get a reduction in their property taxes, get their property tax assessed at the use value, whether that's farming or forestry, and not what's considered the highest and best use, which is always a development standard, which in many cases is not necessarily the highest and best use from an ecological standpoint. And David is right, that's been a very successful program. A lot of forest land and a lot of farmland is enrolled in that program. It does have some management obligations on the part of the landowner. And David, I've seen some, with the budget conversations going around Vermont, I expect there is going to be a discussion within the next year about how that program might better serve the state. There's some folks who want to look for budget savings from it. I think others will want to look for opportunities to make it more effective in conserving land. And you know, there are a lot of people will be involved in that conversation. VNRC certainly will, and we'll keep our members informed about any opportunities to take part in those discussions.
Brian, I think while our Vermont Alliance for Half Earth has not gotten involved really in public policy discussions to this point, I guess our hope is that by promoting kind of greater public understanding of biodiversity and the threat that it's under, and seeing what they can do, you know, in their yard, in their town, that they become more active participants in the political process,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and build energy and support for good policy changes.
Well, that's a great point. Our goal is always to encourage our members to participate in public policy discussions, whether it's at the local or the state level.
Yeah.
Had a comment, less of a question, is Zach agreed with David about the current use program, believes that there might be an opportunity for different categories of enrollment, and explicitly pointed out that the Worcester Range Management Unit Long Range Management Plan, I think that's for the Putnam State Forest, but for the public lands in Middlesex, Stowe, Waterbury, Elmore, the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Forest Parks and Recreation is currently working on a long range management plan for that land, and there will be opportunities for the public to weigh in on that. So thanks for that, Zach. I want to, we usually try to wrap things up by about 12:45 to make sure that we have an opportunity for questions if there are any, and to make sure that we can end promptly at 1. I did want to ask Stephanie to put up a link to a short 4-minute video. It's one of those whiteboard videos, and it was put together by Enrique Sala, who's the National Geographic Explorer in Residence, which is maybe one of the coolest job titles ever, and Tom Udall, who's a U.S. Senator from New Mexico. And it's a little overview of their 30 by 30 to Save Nature resolution, and there's a companion resolution in the House. And there's a large cross-section of national and international and state organizations working on this 30-30 resolution, and ultimately the goal of conserving 30% of the nation's land and water by 2030. They make a very impassioned case about why it's important to offset the kind of ecological threats that Walt gave an overview, including the mass extinction. It's a really interesting little video that explains it, and there's been a big effort to get different political leaders to sign on to that. And I will say this is election year, and VNRC tries to stay out of elections. One of the major candidates for president has signed on and made a commitment to pursue the 30 by 30 reservation. I'll let you do your own research to figure out which one that is. But I really encourage folks to look at the video and get involved in that. If this is a tipping point and we're able to make that moonshot, the 30 by 30 effort at the national level is the way to do that. So having another question here from Judy to Walt. As you know, some of the latest research shows the importance of invasives in creating diverse biodiversity and calls to identify these plants, fish, and animals as introduced rather than invasive. How does this impact the thinking of Half Earth? For example, plants like Japanese knotweed are not only food but medicine for treating Lyme disease. In these times, considering the cultural diversity of people, should we consider the biological diversity too? And you know, this can be a controversial concept that as the climate change, our ecology is changing, and there are some that argue that that's a natural process. Others that argue that we need to hold on to kind of the native wealth that we have on the landscape. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Judy. This, I have to say, this is perhaps the most complex question for me, scientifically and ethically to grapple with. And because as a conservation scientist, I absolutely know the threats to overall biological diversity that invasives play. And we see that in forested ecosystems, aquatic systems. Yet at the same time, you know, from my work in Puerto Rico and other places, species are moving around a lot. And some of these novel ecosystems that come into play harbor a lot of diversity and provide a whole range of services. And I've had a lot of experience this last year working with Native Hawaiians and folks in New Zealand. And there's just a very nuanced conversation around how to think about sort of novel new members of ecosystems. So I don't have a great answer, Judy, but to me, this is one that is worthy of grappling with. And your larger question about cultural diversity as we think about sort of the history of these systems, the management of them, is well taken as well.
Yeah. Thanks. Hey,
Just one of the resources that Doug Talamay has developed, and he's an entomologist at the University of Delaware, who I mentioned before. He and some of his graduate students have developed a resource that by zip code tells you, you know, what the native species are, kind of where you live, and then identify what he calls keystone species, you know, so like in Vermont, like an oak tree that provides habitat and food for many, many, many species. And you can zero in on your zip code when you're kind of thinking about your property, kind of what's on it and what might be missing and what might you add. Because I mean, while I agree with Walt that it is a nuanced issue, it's also clear, and Edward Wilson says, you know, invasive species are the second leading cause of extinction after habitat loss. But it's kind of fun to zero in on your zip code. You know, as you zero in on Vermont conservation design on your property and think about what you'd like to have there for good habitat.
Judy did send a reminder that 12,000 years ago, there were no plants in Vermont. I assume you're referring to the time of the glaciers. So everything is right. Introduced to some level. Stephanie put up a link to a number of stories that the Alliance for Half-Earth developed working with somebody from the Field Naturalist program that Walt runs, that looked at some examples. And I saw an earlier comment from Sabina about I guess that was a response about somebody who restored a wetland on their property. Those stories are available on our webpage. I think they're on the North Branch Nature Center webpage, Curt. And they're very inspiring. And they just include basically experiences from Vermont residents who've grappled with the kind of concepts that we're talking about how to manage their own property and steps that they've taken to promote diversity. Yeah.
Walt, can you show on your screen the landing page for those stories?
I can try. It might be better actually if Stephanie does.
Okay.
I'm having bandwidth issues.
Well, you might want to introduce your master's student who did this work.
Sure. If it shows up there, are you talking about Eric Hagen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think many of you are familiar with the Field Naturalist program. It's really a program at the University of Vermont that's dedicated to really investigating landscape level biological diversity. And Eric was a recent field naturalist that we recruited to really engage with Half-Earth at the watershed level and put together a range of stories, including one about George. But I'll let you introduce it further, Curt.
Well, we were, Walt was talking before about the watershed. So these are all stories from the watershed, you know, about what people have done. So there's a story about you know, a suburban landowner in Montpelier who let his lawn go into a wetlands, and he chronicled all the changes. You can see in the middle there, that's George Shank's flatbread location. There are forest owners, there are people who have put their land in the kind of permanent conservation easements. And I think Eric wisely kind of took the story approach, because I think he recognized that, you know, our behavior is strongly influenced by what respected friends and neighbors do. So these are some respected friends and neighbors who have taken biodiversity to heart in the Winooski watershed. So I'd encourage you to kind of read these stories because they're very, very well done. And there's also kind of a background piece on biodiversity.
Yeah, and just as a plug, the Field Naturalist program is a great program that has introduced a lot of really qualified, competent professionals into the state in the field. So there is another question, bouncing off Judy's question, what's the baseline that you're using to determine native species? And there's also another question, Curt, you mentioned Doug Talamay's search engine for species, Keystone Species. Somebody wanted to know how to access that.
Stephanie, can you find that while we're talking?
Sure, yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay.
And then so maybe the other question, what's the baseline that you're using to determine native species? That's an interesting question given that 12,000 years ago.
I'm glad Judy brought up the long timeline of thinking about diversity in a place. It is a slippery question. I think, you know, with climate shifting, as it has shifted in different ways, you know, through history, biodiversity responds to that and to other factors as well, obviously disturbances, et cetera. I think broadly people use this, you know, pre-European settlement condition of Vermont as a baseline, recognizing that it's by far from a perfect one. And there's a lot of debate around that, but I think that's probably the conventional wisdom around thinking about that. And what's more important that is, you know, the ecosystems that were present and how they functioned and what was lost as they were compromised and what can be restored again to some degree in the future.
Yeah. You know, I think, well, you had mentioned before interactions in ecosystems. I think Doug Talamay kind of embraces that in making the, you know, distinction between native and non-native species. You know, so species that are actually interacting, you know, widely within an ecosystem.
I do agree. And if you haven't seen any of his videos, I think he does a really good job at highlighting really the importance of insects. You know, if you're thinking about bird diversity in your yard, for instance, and you're thinking about the plantings that you may do there, the studies that Doug and other people have done really highlight the diversity of insects, particularly caterpillars that occur in native shrubs as opposed to ornamentals that are planted. And he says that can make an enormous difference, for instance, in the bird diversity that's supported even in someone's yard. So that's a key part of it.
Yeah.
Brian, you want to put a plug in for next June?
Well, I kind of wanted to, as we're getting towards the end of it, ask what are some of the next steps for the Alliance in your mind, Curt? And one of them is next June, Doug Talamay, through the Alliance's efforts and some of the partners, including VNRC, are looking to bring Doug to Vermont for a couple of different events that haven't quite been figured out yet.
Yeah, I think the penciled in dates are June 3rd and 4th. So, I mean, I concur. If any of you have not seen his videos, they're extraordinary. And so we're very fortunate to have him here. He was going to be here in August, in about a month, but obviously we've changed those plans. So he'll be here for 2 days with us in June next year. And I think our Half Earth are going to be developing some plans around his visit. So we're thinking of, for instance, another Vermont spring backyard bio blitz, along with school bio blitzes, kind of building up to his visit, where we can share the findings from those bio blitzes, and he can comment on kind of what we found. So we take kind of full advantage of his presence with us. The other thing on the horizon is Eric Hagen is going to continue to work and develop more of these stories and more of these resources that we can kind of share broadly across the state and beyond. And we're also looking at a kind of a partnership with the Half Earth Project, which is based on the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. That foundation is very interested kind of in our local efforts and thinking about using it as a kind of a model or a template for other kind of regional Half Earth like efforts. I'd also like to hand that over to Walter, because Walter is a source of many of the great ideas in our Half Earth work. So I'm kind of wondering what he's thinking about for our future.
Well, thanks for just giving me a moment. I'm very interested in this whole idea of phenology monitoring. And phenology is really, it's the PHENOLGY. It's a subset of ecology that looks at biological responses to the seasons. It's really nature's calendar. And, you know, as we know, with climate shifting, we're getting some phenological mismatches occurring, such as the hatching of birds and the availability of caterpillars can be interrupted by that. And this is a citizen science approach that everybody can get involved in, you know, through iNaturalist or the US Phenology Project, all sorts of things like that. And I see Alicia's on here. I just want to say Alicia's a naturalist with the city of Burlington and teaches in the Field Naturalist program. But we're really trying to focus on the biodiversity of the city of Burlington, but look at it in a phenological lens, you know, basically from mid-April to the beginning of June. How do we monitor not only what's there, but when they're there and what's the behaviors of the more than human world in the city? So that's something we're looking forward to in spring 2021.
Great. I guess I want to see if there's maybe one or two more questions before we wrap it up. Yep. Seeing that, I really appreciate Walt and Curt, you're taking the time today. I appreciate everybody else for zooming in with us. There are a lot of resources that were put up in the chat box and will remain on VNRC's webpage, including the community strategies, access to the different tools that were discussed today, and more information about the 30 by 30 movement at the national level. And yep, Stephanie says we're going to be posting them all on our website. And I'll remind folks, if you came in late or you think you know somebody who'd like to see this, it is going to be recorded and also available on our website. So it's just about 1 o'clock. Thank you guys. It was really informative and a great day.
Thank you
for inviting us, Brian. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
Well, what a great way to spend some time at lunch.
Hey,
Curt, are those